With our roundtable, political consultant Mario Morrow is back with us, and so is Jill Alper of Alper Strategies. Tori Sachs is the executive director of Michigan Rising Action. She directed John James' campaign back in 2018. We're going to talk about that race coming up. And our partner in this poll over at the Detroit News is their editorial page editor, Nolan Finley. Nolan, let me start with you. What was your biggest takeaway? Was there anything that jumped out at you from our findings?
I'm surprised that it was as close as it was, that Trump was as strong as he was at this stage against the Democratic field. Other than Joe Biden in the head-to-heads, I mean, he's doing fairly well considering the bad press he's received, if you will. I don't think he's any worse.
It just shows how cemented we all are into positions, though, doesn't it?
I don't
doesn't
know that
matter what happens.
I don't know that he's any worse shape than he was at the start of the campaign in the fall of 2016. I think if you go back to those polls, he's about where he was against Hillary Clinton at Labor Day in that campaign. I mean, it tells me that Michigan's still very much in play.
I was surprised, Jill, to find that Michael Bloomberg was the second strongest candidate in this for a guy who has really barely started running. Actually, I shouldn't say barely started running. There are quite a few ads that are on right now, but hasn't really shown up here much yet. We don't really have him as a fixture in our mind, I didn't think yet.
Right, well, it just goes to show you the power in advertising, because you can get people to focus before they're ready to focus, but that I think also in Michael Bloomberg you have a compelling story that's a different story that would resonate in an electorate. People forget our primary is open too. So I think the poll did reflect a number of independent-minded, where the president's not doing so well, support for Michael Bloomberg. So we may see a lot of Republicans who aren't happy with Trump looking to see or to influence who the Democratic nominee is.
Be interesting. Mario, it's interesting. If you're a Democrat or you're supporting Democratic candidates and you look at a poll and a guy who's been impeached is only 7 points ahead of the strongest rival that you can present, that seems to suggest quite a challenge.
Quite disturbing to a lot of people, especially the Democrats. I agree with Nolan. I'm surprised that it's so close. And also, I'm surprised even on the senatorial side that James and Peters are as close as they are, even though the power of the dollar, and James has been raising a lot of money, and Peters has been outside the state raising money, but hasn't had that visibility. But yes, Democrats, I believe, are quite disturbed that it's as close as it is with all the problems and issues that Mr. Trump has had.
In fact, Tori, let's talk about the James race, which you're pretty familiar with that. I think what that, even though he lost to Debbie Stabenow, he seemed to show a certain degree of viability, I suppose, to a lot of national Republican movers and thinkers, and so they're more than happy to let him run again against a first-time or a rookie senator.
Sure. I remember last time John was, a political nobody. He had never raised a dollar. He had never been in politics. He was a military veteran. He was a West Point grad. He was a successful business leader in Detroit. And to raise the money that he did against, in the primary, if you remember, it was a $10 million primary, and then going up against Senator Stabenow, who's been in office for 18 years, I think John did great. He built a huge, call it grassroots army of people who supported him last time that are supporting him even more this time. And these are small dollar donors in Michigan, across the state, and around the country. And that's what Mario said, he was raising money, and that's really who's fueling his fight right now.
Well, I mentioned to Richard the money that it takes to run a Senate campaign these days is...
Well, or a House campaign. You look at what Slotkin and Bishop spent last night.
Right.
I think in that race, what we're seeing in the poll is pretty much the partisan breakdown in Michigan. It pretty much reflects the number of percentage of Republicans, percentage of Democrats. Very high undecided. It was 16-17%, and that's where the fight's going to be. I think you substitute any Republican name, any Democratic name, you're going to get that same result as that poll showed.
Well, Jill, let me let you weigh in on what I mentioned to Mario. Is there a degree of frustration there that you've got a president who not only has been impeached, but a trade war that has been, I don't want to say uniquely harmful to Michigan, but it's certainly been felt here in maybe more profound ways than a lot of other places, and yet you really don't have a runaway candidate. Is that surprising to you, or is that just where we are?
No, not at this stage in the process. I mean, I think it's definitely deserves some inquiry, but at the same time, we know that the two sides are pretty hardened in their partisan ways. There always is a fight for that 10, 11, 12, 13% in the middle. There is not clarity. I was actually surprised, frankly, that all of the Democrats were ahead of Trump, albeit 2 of them in margin of error. So the feeling thermometer being up at 9.5% when there's turnout and an excited electorate, that means our Democrats are going to show up. We saw that in 2018. And so I think people are excited and focused. They like to talk about the issues and the differences, and that this impeachment thing may be somewhat or more behind us than it was a month ago, not sucking up all of the oxygen so that Democrats can do what they did in the 2018 election.
And Devin, I wouldn't make any assumptions about where Michigan voters stand on the trade issues. I was out to Macomb County Friday morning, and their take on this whole trade, particularly trade war with China, is, hey, somebody's standing up against people who have taken our jobs for decades. So,
But that's Macomb County.
well, and that's a big county,
Yeah,
and pretty indicative
Macomb
of
County
how
Democrats.
Michigan goes, you know.
But we're watching 1,500 steel jobs going away. The agriculture sector has been it'll be years before the soybean market can recover.
Except in a lot of areas, a lot of places, agriculture receipts are up this year. I mean, across the Midwest. So again, I wouldn't
Does that
read
include
too
the
much.
subsidies?
No, I mean the subsidies certainly will help the farmers,
Exactly.
as we mentioned last week. But I don't know that those folks. You keep hearing, well, folks. Trump's voters are voting against their own interests. I don't know that they see it that way.
Tori, I said on the program 2 weeks ago, it's a weird thing to say that I don't think that impeachment is an issue for voters, because the voters have already made up their minds. But isn't that's sort of how it feels right now, isn't it? I mean, it's not really, you're either in or you're not in.
I think what voters voted for in 2018 was the Democratic message of health care and prescription drugs. They got none of that. They've gotten 2 years of obstruction, 2 years of impeachment, 2 years of stopping things like the USMCA, which would help our manufacturing and our agriculture industry. And I think that's what voters are caring about. I think as we start to see Trump deliver that message in Michigan, he was here in Battle Creek, he's been in Toledo, I think the president's chances looks pretty good.
Is that fair?
I think people do want to see something get done, but at the same time, there are all kinds of bills coming out of the House that aren't being dispensed with in the Senate. And I think that there are issues
Like all
now
of them.
there of tone and a record and what kind of a president, there are issues, and then there's who's sitting in the Oval Office. And you just have to think about this last week and what's happened abroad. People were frightened about and are frightened about what's happening in the world. And so I do think that while people want progress, they want a steady hand at the realm. At the helm, excuse me.
Mario, lastly, before I got to get to a break, but that's where we remain. Everybody seems to be so cemented in position. Largely, it seems to me how you felt about what happened with the president's actions regarding Iraq and Iran have to do with whether you supported them in the first place.
And that's what
Minds never seem to change.
And that's what makes Michigan so interesting and so important in the whole dynamics of this whole election process. It is a purple state. You mentioned that in your opening. And Richard talked about how it's split down the middle, and how it's not all about metropolitan areas like Detroit, but it's going to be in those small areas, and not even the suburban areas, but those small towns, which I think is going to go back to something that you said, Nolan. And I think it is important on what has happened and what hasn't happened, because I think the farmers and those people who are actually on the ground doing that work are going to make the difference.
I got to get to a break. When we come back, I'll let Nolan respond to that and more. What will be the difference maker then as we head toward Election Day 2020? This is